I hope everybody got an outline of the sermon this morning. If you did not, please raise your hand so you can be given one. There are some people down here who do not have one. Scott. This is a long outline, 8 pages worth. We'll probably be here until about 3 o'clock this afternoon, I guess. Really, there's information on the outline which you will not, which I'm not going to speak about. But this outline is given to you because I wanted it to be a little bit fuller than we were able to cover just in one sermon. We've been talking about a look at the book, just a brief look at what the Bible looks like. What is it saying? What is it teaching? So many people read the Bible very spontaneous way. They just open the Bible and read a psalm. They open it tomorrow night and they'll read something from the book of Acts, and then tomorrow night they'll read something from the book of Numbers, and they never get the idea of what the Bible really is all about. So last Sunday morning we talked about the history section of the Old Testament. I was going to conclude the Old Testament there, but a number of people asked if we would go ahead and continue this and talk about the wisdom literature and then about the prophetic literature. So today we're going to take the wisdom literature. I think you'll find that the wisdom literature in the Bible is a very interesting portion of this very challenging book. The wisdom literature is made up of 5 books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. I guess that the book of Psalms is the most popular book in the entire Bible. People have read the 23rd Psalm. Many of us memorized that psalm when we were just little children. Well, the writers of the Psalms, the writers of all of the wisdom literature and of all of the prophets, they lived during the time that we covered last Sunday morning. That is the historical period. And so it's sort of like I'm going to write a history of the United States. And so I write that history, and then in the back of the history book, I incorporate some of the writings of great Americans. And so you have the history book, and then you have the writings of great men who lived during that period of time. Well, that's really the way the Old Testament is set up. We have the history section, and then we have a collection of the writings of some of the people who lived during that time. And these writings begin with Job, and they end up with Malachi. Moses and Job are probably the only 2 writers that did not live during the period of the conquest of Canaan and the time of the judges and the monarchy and so forth. Moses, of course, lived prior to the time of the conquest. And Job, we don't really know exactly when he lived. But it's generally thought that he lived during what we refer to frequently as a patriarchal period. Well, these are poetic books. As a matter of fact, many times this section of the Old Testament is referred to as the poetry of the Old Testament. Well, people don't realize a lot of times, but almost all of the prophetic material was also written in poetic form. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, most of what they wrote is written in poetic form. So it really isn't correct to say that these are constitute the poetic section of the Old Testament. Poetry is kind of peculiar. You can't really translate poetry from one language to another and get the same thrust as you get in the original language. Why is that true? Well, because sometimes the rhythm, particularly of Hebrew poetry, the rhythm has a great deal to do with the feeling and meaning of the poetry. Well, you can't do that. You can't translate the rhythm from one language to another. A lot of times we think of rhyme, in poetry. The Hebrews never thought of rhyme. They thought of other things instead. Now, I'm not going to go greatly into this, but if you sit down and read the Psalms and Proverbs, you'll find that there's something called parallelism. Parallelism just says, well, he made a statement, like this, and then he came along and made another statement right behind it, which says the same thing but in a little different words. And so this is called, this parallelism is called synonymous parallelism, because it's the same. A synonym we get from it. And so here I have a couple of examples of that. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. Well, you see how that fits together? That's characteristic of Hebrew poetry. And then there is what we call sometimes antithetic or antithesis, opposite parallelism. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly will perish. And so as we read the Psalm, we find this constantly coming to mind, this idea of parallelism. Now, there are many other things. There are similitudes and things like this that also come up, but parallelism is the most prominent. Now, there's another thing here that really could not be translated, and that's the idea of acrostic. Acrostic means that the first line begins with this letter of the alphabet. The next line begins with the next letter of the alphabet, and the following line with the third letter of the alphabet. And this is called a acrostic structure. Well, obviously, we can't translate something like that because some of the letters that they had and the translation don't correspond with the letters in the English language. And so we miss that. To the Hebrew people, this would be a very important aspect of the poetic form. And poems many times with the Hebrews were structured along these lines. Well, let's look at the books of poetry themselves for just a moment. Then we'll talk about the message, finally, the message of these books. Let's look at the book of Job. Well, the author of Job is not identified anywhere in the book. The book just begins by saying there was a man in the land of Uz by the name of Job. But it doesn't tell us really who wrote this book. It's generally thought that Job himself wrote the book. And then we have the Psalms. The Psalms basically are all anonymous. Ordinarily, we talk about the Psalms of David. Well, David is not identified anywhere in any of the texts of the Psalms. But traditionally, David has been thought of as the author of many of the Psalms, and in fact, he was. But all of the Psalms are really anonymous, but up at the top, before you get into reading the Psalm, sometimes there's what's called a superscription, and it says, this is a Psalm of David. Well, that is not a part of the text itself. That's something that was put in by editors and compilers and so forth many, many years later. The book of Proverbs is an interesting book. The book of Proverbs is a collection of wise sayings and wise advice. The Psalms are a collection of poems. We'll talk more about each of these in just a moment. Proverbs is a collection of wise sayings. Now, I have on page 2 of the outline, I've got the way Proverbs is broken down, and you'll notice that sometimes it says these are the Psalm, or the Proverbs rather, of Solomon. And we'll find that Solomon personifies wisdom. Wisdom speaks. Wisdom says this. Wisdom does that. And this is the way Solomon instructs his son. And so in the first part of Proverbs, this is what we have. In beginning with the 10th chapter of Proverbs, we have a little different thing, but still these are called the Proverbs of Solomon. When you get to the 22nd chapter of Proverbs, in the 17th verse, it says, these are the sayings of the wise, but it doesn't tell us who wrote them. These are the sayings of the wise. Very, very fine for us to read those things. And then again, we have additional Proverbs by Solomon. But an interesting thing is in the 30th and 31st chapters of the book of Proverbs. In the 30th chapter, it mentions that These proverbs come from Agur, the son of Jakeh. Well, we've never heard of him before. He's not mentioned anywhere in the history section or anywhere else in the Bible. But here is a chapter in Proverbs which it mentions was written by him. And the 31st chapter of Proverbs, it says, these are the oracles of King Lemuel, which his mother taught him. Well, sometimes people say, well, wait a minute now. How is it that we know that this really ought to be a part of the Bible? Well, that's okay. The New Testament is very much the same way. Who was Luke? Luke was not one of the apostles. Luke was a Gentile. And yet we accept Luke as a part of the Bible, just like we accept the book of Proverbs as a part of the Bible. We need to remember that the poetic, the Psalms and the Proverbs, these two poetic books, they are collections. And they were written over a long period of time. At least the book of Psalms was written over a long period of time. One of my favorite books along this line is the book of Ecclesiastes. A lot of people don't like this book. They say it's too pessimistic. Well, the book of Ecclesiastes is somewhat pessimistic in places, but it's very optimistic if we take a close look at it, because at the end of the book, he gives us the key to the optimism that ought to characterize the life of every one of us. The book of Ecclesiastes is generally thought to have been written by Solomon, but it just says that Solomon was the king. It doesn't tell us who the real author is. I take it that Solomon was the author, but it could have been by some other person who wrote about Solomon. A little bit more about that in just a moment. Well, let me mention this. The book begins by saying the words of Solomon. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that he wrote these words, but he could have spoken these words and someone else wrote them. For example, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have the words of Christ, don't we? But Jesus didn't write any of those things. He spoke them, and they were written out, and the circumstances and all were written out by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then there's another book called the Song of Solomon. I suppose that the Song of Solomon is one of the most neglected books of the entire Old Testament. It's basically a love song. It's a song that Solomon wrote or sang to the woman or one of the women that he loved. He had a lot of women, you know, in his life. He had a whole host of concubines. He had a whole host of wives. And the Song of Solomon is a beautiful love song that he wrote in reference to one of his wives. And then we have the book of Job. The book of Job is a story about, and written in poetic form, but it's a story about a man who was very, very wealthy, but a very godly man at the same time. It has, one of the strange things about the book of Job is that it has two scenes where the devil presents himself to God. And God says to Job, Satan says, "You see Job, my servant?" "Yes." "See what a good man he is, how faithful he is?" "Yes." And so Satan says, "Well, the reason he's faithful is because you've blessed him so much." And the story of Job is the story of how God allowed Satan to impoverish Job, a wealthy man, and he lost everything that he had. A man who had a nice family and every one of his children were killed. A man who had good health and his health was destroyed. Satan is at work in all of this. Yet Job never loses his fidelity. Job never loses his faith. The thrust of the book of Job is very, very important. We'll talk specifically about that in just a moment. Ultimately, Job's wealth is restored. His health is restored. You can never restore his children. He did have other children, and the book tells us something that in a very, very vivid way that is very popular in our world today. Job's friends came to him. I'm not sure that we should call them his friends, but Job's friends came to him and said, Job, you know why you're having all this bad luck? You know why everything is turned against you? Why? Because, Job, you are secretly a terrible, terrible sinner. Sin is what causes all of this heartache. Sin is what causes you to lose all of the things you have. And Job said, no, I'm not that kind of person. I'm honest, I'm sincere. Oh, if you were honest and sincere and you were a good person, why would all these terrible things happen to you? Job said, I don't know. You see, Job didn't know of the conversation that had gone on between God and Satan. But today, I remember very vividly, since I used to live in New Orleans, when Hurricane Katrina came, there were people who are popular on television and religious speakers and things like this, and they said, the reason that happened is New Orleans is such a sinful city. No, that's not the reason. The Bible doesn't give us a reason. The Bible doesn't give us that reason. I remember when I was in New Orleans, we had a hurricane down there also, which was the worst that they had had up until that time. It was called Hurricane Betsy. And after Hurricane Betsy, the Churches of Christ conducted a citywide meeting, Campaign for Christ. They had me on TV along with the gentleman who is doing our speaking, Brother George Bailey. And after they had gone along with the interview, the interviewer turned to me and he said, why did this hurricane happen in the city of New Orleans? Do you believe that it's because New Orleans is very, very sinful? Because that's what some people had said. And my answer was, no. New Orleans is no worse than any other city. New Orleans did not receive that hurricane because New Orleans was sinful. We have no explanation of why this took place. But we do have an explanation of how God will forgive sin, whether New Orleans or New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco or wherever it might be. That's the message that we need to concentrate on. Well, what is the message then of this book of Job? It's a great book. It's a book that is not easy to read, but it's a book that says to us, God is in charge. God is sovereign. You see, He allowed Satan to do certain things. God even governs Satan. Satan has certain parameters that he can't get out of. God is sovereign. God is in charge. I might not know why there was a Hitler. I might not know why there was a Saddam Hussein, or why there is terrorism and all this sort of thing in our country. The point is not whether or not I can explain it. The point is God is in charge. And God is not limited to the time frame that I have. My schedule would say, get rid of all of that evil now, God. God says, Jack, your schedule is not my schedule. I know what I'm doing, God says. I will take care of it in the way that I want to and at the time that I want to. Believe me, God is the one in charge. And this is the message of this book of Job. God is always in charge, no matter what happens to me. So we ask the question, what about the problem of suffering? Why does a good God allow good people to suffer, while the same God allows evil people to prosper? And sometimes people have tried to put this into the context of sin. The Bible never does that. The answer to that question is always, we do not know. The book of Job approaches the problem of suffering. We come face to face with it but it never does tell us the reason. But what it does do is to tell us something about the power of God. Oh, Job was just like we are. Job just got so frustrated with God. Why is this happening to me? And the answer constantly comes back, I don't know. And then in the 38th chapter of the book of Job, God speaks. Oh, they've had this debate back and forth all along, Job's friends and so forth. Now God speaks to Job. It's so interesting to read. I counted these. I may have miscounted, but I think I got it right. There are 57 questions that God asked Job. Now, maybe there's 55, maybe there's 62. I may have missed some. Or I may have counted some twice, I don't know. But I sat down and counted them just while I was preparing this lesson. 57. God's questioning Job covered 129 verses in chapters 38 to 41. Here are some of the questions that God asked Job. You see, Job doesn't have the capacity, just like we don't. We do not have the capacity to understand all that God does. God reminded Job of that. And so one of the first questions he asked, he said, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? A little sarcasm in God's voice right there, isn't there? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Another question he said, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea and walked to the recesses of the deep? Well, of course not. Do you give the horse his strength or clothe his neck with a flowing mane? And all of those questions are answered, no, no, no. What was God doing with Job? He was saying, Job, my wisdom, my power, my plan is so far beyond your possibility to understand. And then Job speaks back. There's only a few verses there in Job's response. Here's part of it. Surely, boy, this ought to sink into us. I do this all the time. You do too. Surely I spoke of things I do not understand. Things that are too wonderful for me to know. Oh boy, doesn't that talk to us? Doesn't that say just exactly what we in fact do? Sometimes we speak about things we just don't know. Finally, Job says, I despise myself, and I repent in sackcloth and ashes. Well, God wasn't trying to humiliate Job. He was trying to impress on Job this great, wonderful truth. I know what I'm doing, Job. It's all under my control. It might not suit you. You might think I'm too late in what I do, but I know what I'm doing. I am the one who is in control. And that's a great message that he gives us in the book of Job. Let's take a brief look at the book of Psalms also. I've mentioned the fact that the authors are not identified. But there are these little superscriptions. I've mentioned a number of things on the outline there that you can read for yourself. But these little superscriptions tell us who people thought were the writers of some of the Psalms. The Psalms themselves are divided into a number of different groups. Scholars have come along and said, well, this Psalm has this theme. This psalm has that theme and so forth. And so they divided them up, and I've just listed some of these here. Tonight, by the way, be sure to come tonight, all of you. Tonight we're going to talk about the 8th Psalm, which is referred to as a psalm of praise or a hymn of praise. It's a fascinating psalm, and I think that you will enjoy taking a look at that. And then some of the psalms are laments. Lament for the whole community, maybe the whole nation. Some of the psalms are songs of lament of just an individual. For example, how long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? And so this this is a psalm of just lament. Then we have royal psalms, we have psalms of wisdom, we have psalms of thanksgiving, we have psalms of trust. Well, when we read the Psalms and we think in these terms, the Psalms make so much more sense to us. The Song of Solomon, I've already mentioned just a little bit. The Song of Solomon is a good illustration of how detached we are from some of the figures of speech that we find in the Bible. For example, as Solomon is complimenting his wife and telling her how beautiful she is, he uses some things that I do not advise for any man to use on his wife. What if you told your wife, men, your hair is like a flock of goats from Mount Gilead? That's not much of a compliment, is it? But that's one of the compliments that he gives, that Solomon gives to his wife. And then he says, your neck is like the Tower of David, built with elegance. On it hang 1,000 shields. All of them are shields of the warriors. I don't think that sounds like much of a compliment to a lady today. And yet, in the figures and the symbols that they used in those days, these things were great compliments. I mentioned to you that the book of Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books. The book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon's search for meaning in life. When I say that, I stop and think to myself, hey folks, this speaks so directly to our generation. People are looking to try and find, what does life really mean? What is life really all about? What is happiness? How can I find it? How can I secure it for myself? These are the very things that people are talking about. Solomon was looking for the same thing. How did he do it? Well, Solomon thought that he would search for things. The first thing that he did was he decided that wisdom and education is the key to life. Boy, have you ever heard of that? The problem, the solution to the alcohol problem, the solution to the drug problem, the solution to sexual immorality is to instruct and tell people. Educate them. Educate them on sex. Educate them on addiction. Educate them on these various things about alcohol and so forth. Education is the key. No, it's not. That's what Solomon thought. I can find meaning to life if I just know things, if I'm wise. Well, just because I know something doesn't mean that I will do it. I may know what is right and refuse to do what is right. So Solomon explored this a little bit, and he finds out that, you know, this sounds like a contradiction, but this is the way Solomon treated it. Wisdom is really foolish. Wisdom is really folly. What did he mean when he talked like that? He says it's like trying to catch the wind. That's foolish to think of, isn't it? But that's the way wisdom is when wisdom is isolated out here. That's the way education is. And he talked about how he had learned so many things, and he really educated himself in all kinds of things. Well, we have that problem today. There's another one here. And this is really with us, especially right here in Los Angeles. Pleasure. Pleasure is the key to life. Just enjoy everything. And Solomon was a wealthy man. And so he had entertainers from everywhere come in, and they would entertain him endlessly. Men singers, women singers, fine musicians of all kinds, dancers and so forth. We would say wine, women, and song. He says he did not deny himself of any pleasure. But then he came to the conclusion about this, and he said, you know what? I found out that seeking pleasure is like trying to catch the wind, striving after the wind. And yet we are encapsulated with the idea of pleasure seeking. Kind of pitiful, isn't it? Well, he tried building projects. He built houses. He planted vineyards. He did all kinds of things like that. And he finally concluded, yeah, that's just like all the rest of it. It's like trying to put wind in a bottle. Well, as he went along in this book of Ecclesiastes, go home and read the book. It is just a great book to read. It's only 12 chapters long. And it's just a great book to read. Along the way, he makes some very important observations about life itself and about his own experience. It gives some really good bits of information for us. And then finally, he comes to the conclusion. And I want to come to the conclusion of this lesson with this idea. In the last chapter of the book, he tells us, amidst all the pessimism of the things I've sought and have failed in trying to find a meaning to life, but I haven't found it, he finally gives us the answer. What is the answer? 12th chapter, first verse. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no more pleasure in them. You see, so many times young people want to, live life, have pleasure, have money, buy things. And Solomon says, listen, that doesn't work. Remember your Creator. Not when you get old, when nothing else matters anymore, not then. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before these days come when you say, pleasure is gone. And then finally, in the last few verses of the book, he says, everything's been said. This is the end of the matter. All hath been said. And here it is. Listen to it. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring into judgment all that we have done, he says, whether it be good or bad. Boy, that is good advice. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And remember that fear of the Lord, respect for the Lord, respect for His Word, respect for His commandments, obedience to the Lord. These are the keys to the meaning of life. The wisdom literature of the Old Testament is just a trove of so many good things. If you're present this morning and you are not a Christian, don't you want to be a Christian? Don't you want to be a child of God? As a youth, as a middle-aged person, as an older person, fear God. Keep His commandments. This is your duty. If you're not a Christian, you can be baptized into Christ today and leave this building as a child of God. Will you come while we stand together and sing, please?